Now, quickly, I want to take a look at some of the more powerful and more important totalitarian governments that develop in the 1920s and 1930s. The earliest signs of totalitarianism around the world begin really in Japan. So, as the Great Depression worsens, it begins to threaten the Japanese economy. Now, Japan had come out of World War One better off than just about anybody other than the United States. Their manufacturing base and their population and their um, financial sustainability doesn't face the same widespread destruction and chaos that Western Europe does. However, Japan geographically is, compared to the other Western powers and the other major Asian powers, is a relatively small country. And it's not a particularly wealthy one in terms of natural resources. So Japan, even in the 1920s, 1930s, after World War One, is still heavily dependent upon imports from foreign countries, especially for specific items. Number one, steel, and number two, crude oil, which can then be turned into gasoline, etc. Right? So many in Japan look at the financial crisis as yet another example of Westerners screwing things up for the Japanese people, much the way that imperialism has destroyed and raped Asia. They see this global financial crisis as just another in a string of Western debacles that they are going to have to somehow navigate themselves. So the solution for many Japanese is in empire, is in further imperialism. And they feel like if they can build a large enough and more sustainable empire, especially one that can provide them with the raw materials that their manufacturing base needs, mainly oil and iron to produce steel, then they will be able to remain financially self sufficient and they will be able to essentially cut off ties with the West. They'll no longer be dependent upon these Westerners and their flawed ways any longer, right? So in the 20s and early 30s, what begins to happen is a essentially peaceful military takeover of the government. The Japanese government, which had been a constitutional monarchy after about 1870 or so, maintains a semblance of democratic government. It maintains the Japanese parliament. It maintains the emperor as the head of the government. But in reality, the emperor basically simply becomes a figurehead, and a military oligarchy controls the country. Basically, the Japanese army and the Japanese navy and the heads of the Japanese Army and Navy become the true power behind the scenes. And this is semi ironic if you look at Japanese history, because this is essentially the reestablishment of a shogunate, right? Where the emperor is the nominal head of the country, but the real power lies within a military dictatorship. And in the 1920s and 1930s, that's essentially what the Japanese reestablish, right? Um, as in all totalitarian governments, opposition to the military and to military control is silenced in the government. The imperial cabinet and the imperial parliament is basically overrun and filled with military officers who support military initiatives. Any opponents of this militarization of the Japanese government are arrested and sent for what's called re-education. Essentially, this is secret police and forced labor camps. And the Japanese also buy into fascism somewhat in that they latch on to kind of this nationalistic identity, and they harness the Japanese people's feelings of racial inferiority, their treatment and their resent at the so-called Big Three at the end of World War One, as well as just Westerners in general. Even after the industrialization of Japan, Japan was still seen as one of the minor powers. Although they had defeated China in war and they had even defeated Russia in 1903 and 1904, they were still not seen as an equal with the Western European and the United States in terms of being a real global power. And so the Japanese government harnesses these feelings of resentment and they harness these feelings of inferiority and they create this kind of hyper nationalistic link to their samurai and Bushido past. And the modern Japanese military is seen as kind of a reawakening of this samurai way of life, of honor and duty and sacrifice, in terms of, serving the betterment of the people through war, right? And that kind of militarism is harnessed in pursuit of what the Japanese call a new Asian order, which is essentially their plans to create an all Asian empire headed by the Japanese, which would then be free of Western imperialism. It would be free of dependence upon Western imports and Western goods, and that would allow Japan to become financially self sufficient and basically to cut all ties with the West. Right. And you can see a lot of this in the Japanese propaganda of the time. On the left, you have a poster that was created by the Japanese government to commemorate the signing of what's known as the Tripartite Alliance, where Nazi Germany, the Empire of Japan, and the Empire of Italy created defensive alliance with one another, which is going to go on to become the Axis powers in World War II. On the right hand side, you have some examples of anti Western propaganda that comes out of Japan. Now, this one is specifically aimed at the Indian people, depicting how the British specifically, but Westerners in general, have exploited India for their own benefit and how Indian blood is on their hands, encouraging the Indian people to rise up against Western imperialism. This is another popular Japanese poster. In this one, Great Britain and the United States are portrayed as octopus, kind of spreading their tentacles out throughout Asia. And in this one, you see kind of the beginnings of this idea of a new Asian order, where the only thing that can protect Asia, the only thing that can drive out the Westerners, is the strength of a large, powerful Japanese military. And you see kind of with, the stark black outline, the idea that Japan is creating of this kind of all Asian empire disconnected from the West and free of Western interference. Now, another totalitarian government that rises up in the 1920s and 1930s is the Soviet Union in Russia. Now, here's the thing about the Soviet Union. They are 100% totalitarian. However, they are completely anti-fascist. Okay, they do not harness the ideas of nationalism in order to unify and motivate and collectivize their people. Instead, their ideology is tied to the socialist and communist uprising that takes place in Russia at the end of World War One. Now, this becomes significantly more totalitarian in the 1920s when Joseph Stalin becomes the head of the Communist Party in Russia. Stalin is an extreme radical socialist. He views socialism as the key to eliminating Western influence and Western meddling in Russia. And under his watch, Russia embarks on this very extreme form of socialism known as Russian communism. Stalin very quickly nationalizes all property. What this means is, unlike under Marxist socialism, where the government owns the means of production and they own and operate businesses and set, a planned economy, in under Russian communism, all property is owned by the government, not just the means of production and not just business, all property. No, there under Russian communism, there is no such thing as private property. You do not own a home. The state allows you to live in that home. You do not own a car. The state provides you that car. You do not own clothing or a watch or any kind of property. All of it belongs to the state, which means, and this is especially effective for a totalitarian government, since it belongs to the state, it can be taken from you at any point in time, right? And under Stalin, the Russian economy enacts what's known as 5-year plans. Now, the idea of a 5-year plan, the idea that the government is going to plan out all business production for the next 5 years, begins under Lenin, but again, once Stalin takes power, it becomes much more radical and much more extreme. Stalin shoves industrialization down the throat of the Russian people. And he does this through what's known as collectivization, where basically the Russian government rounds up entire towns and entire villages and entire communities and collectivizes the land, basically taking away all personal private property, taking the land out from under people's feet and turning it into giant government run agricultural centers or giant government run essentially plantations, right? Also, entire communities are essentially picked up and relocated hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away to completely different cities in order to work in government run factories or on these government run plantations, right? Now, as in any totalitarian government, Stalin very quickly and very brutally purges any opposition to his rule. Millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Russians are put to death by their own government. Millions more are sent to forced labor camps in Siberia and Western Russia, known as gulags. Um, Similar to Adolf Hitler in Germany, Stalin begins massively rebuilding and rearming the Russian military, the Red Army, in order to help dig the Soviet Union out of the economic crisis of the 20s and 30s. There are many security apparatus in the Soviet Union that are loyal strictly to Stalin. He has his own private secret police known as the Cheka. There are also intelligence agencies known as like the NKVD and the KGB, which are used to spy on Russian citizens as well as foreign countries. And this leads to a lot, basically a constant state of fear throughout many parts of the Soviet Union. Um, Again, you see here this kind of constant bombardment of propaganda. Now, in the Soviet Union, because they are not fascist and not centered around kind of this national culturalistic identity, their propaganda is more centrally focused on the worker, right? The working class, and how by uniting the working class under Russian communism, they're going to be able to build the collective good, and they're going to be able to, as this poster shows, kind of march forward into the future under this more collectivized, better, not necessarily freer, but more prosperous future, right? And again, you see here the faces of Russian communism: Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. Again, now, although this does have the sense of kind of pro nationalistic pride, rather than being culturally focused, it's more economically and politically focused, uniting the people under the banner of communism rather than the banner of, say, ethnic or racial superiority or great.